the great political philosophers was to be a kind of legislator for mankind. This, again, is a book with epic ambition. Let me mention, I've emphasized in many ways the absolutist and authoritarian side of Hobbes's teaching. Let me talk about something that might sound oxymoronic. Let me call it, for the moment, Hobbesian liberalism. Hobbes enjoys describing the sovereign in the most absolute and extreme term. Sovereign is to have supreme command over life and death, war and peace, what is to be taught and heard. And yet, in many ways, the Hobbesian sovereign aims to allow for ample room for individual liberty. And he even set some limits on the legitimate use of sovereign power. For all of his tough talk, Hobbes takes justice and the rule of law very seriously, far more seriously than, for example, does Machiavelli. Thus, at one time in the book, or one point, he maintains that a person cannot be made to accuse themselves without the assurance of pardon. You can't be forced to accuse yourself, what we would call the Fifth Amendment. You cannot be forced to accuse yourself. Similarly, he says a wife or a parent cannot be coerced to accuse a loved one. And on a similar point, he maintains that punishment can never be used as an instrument of revenge, but only for what he calls the correction, or what we would call the rehabilitation of the offender. Add to the above Hobbes's repeated insistence that laws serve as an instrument for achieving social equality. In a chapter called "Of the Office of the Sovereign Representative," Hobbes argues that justice be equally administered to all classes of people, rich as well as poor, the equal application of justice. He maintains further that titles of nobility are of value only for the benefits they confer on those of lesser rank, or they're not useful at all. Equal justice, he tells us, requires equal taxation policy, and he seems to be proposing a kind of consumption tax so that the rich who consume more will have to pay their fair share. And he argues that indigent citizens who are unable to provide for themselves should not be forced to rely simply upon the private charity of individuals, but should be maintained at public expense. He seems in this way to anticipate what we might think of as the modern welfare state, that public assistance be provided and the poor not simply depend on the private goodwill of their others. But most importantly, I think, is to go back to the importance given to the individual in Hobbes's philosophy. Hobbes derives the very power of the sovereign from the natural right of each individual to do as they like in the state of nature. And it follows, I think, that the purpose of the sovereign is really to safeguard the natural right of each individual, but to regulate this right so that it becomes consistent with the right of others, and not simply, again, a kind of open war against all, of all against all. What is significant about this, I think, is the priority that Hobbes gives to rights over duties. This, in many ways, arguably makes him the founding father, or maybe we should say godfather, of modern liberalism. The importance given to rights over duties, of the individual over, in many ways, the collective or common good. And I think this is expressed in Hobbes's novel and in many ways altogether unprecedented teaching about liberty in chapter 21, a very famous and important chapter. And here he distinguishes the liberty of what he calls the liberty of the ancients, or what he doesn't exactly call, but I'll call the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. The ancients, he believes, operated with a defective understanding of human freedom. For the ancients, liberty meant living in a self-governing republic. Living in a republic in which everyone, again, took some share in the ruling offices. Liberty, in other words, for the ancients, was not just a property of the individual, it was an attribute of the regime of which one was a member. The Athenians and the Romans, he says, were free. That is, they were free commonwealths. Not that any particular man had the liberty to resist his own representative, but that his representative had the liberty to resist or invade other people. In other words, liberty for the ancients was a collective good, the liberty, as he says, to resist or invade other people. It was a property of the commonwealth, not of the individuals who inhabited it. But that sense of collective liberty, the freedom to resist or invade, is in fact even opposed to the modern idea of liberty that Hobbes proposes. And by liberty, Hobbes means something that sounds very familiar to us. Liberty means the absence of constraints or impediments to action. We are free to the extent that we can act in an unimpeded manner. And it follows from him that political liberty means the freedom to act where the law is silent, as he says. Think of that where the law is silent, we have the freedom to do or not to do as we choose. Very important to the way we think of liberty today in a modern, you might say, liberal democracy. Hobbes' sovereign is more likely to allow citizens a zone of private liberty where they are free to act as they choose than in the classical republic, where there is a kind of coerced participation in collective affairs or in political deliberation. And Hobbes here takes a dig at the defenders of the view in his own day that only the citizens of a republic can be free. There is written, he says, on the turrets of the city of Lucca. And anybody, let me just ask before I continue this passage, anybody here in Pearson College? So you all know the dean, Mr. Amerigo. Yeah, your dean is from the city of Lucca. Ask him if this is true when you see him. There is written on the turrets of the city of Lucca in great characters, meaning great letters, at this day the word libertas. Libertas is written on the walls of the turrets of the city of Lucca. Let's find out if that's still true. Yet no man, Hobbes continues, can thence infer that a particular man has more liberty or immunity from the service of the commonwealth there than in Constantinople, the city of the caliphs, the caliphate. Living in a republic alone doesn't guarantee you more freedom. He says freedom in that interesting passage, freedom here requires, as he puts it, immunity from service. A regime is to be judged for Hobbes on how much private liberty, how much immunity it grants each of its citizens, an idea of individual liberty in many ways unknown and unprecedented in the modern world. And in this respect, one can say that Hobbes has some connection to the creation of what we think of as the modern liberal state, with its conception of private freedom as immunity from forced participation or forced participation in politics. Very different from the ancients. So what does this all mean? Let me talk about what Hobbes has to say for us today. We who have in many ways become Hobbes' children. Hobbes gives us the definitive language of the modern state. Yet he remains in many ways as contested for us as he was in his own time. For many today, Hobbes' conception of the Leviathan state is synonymous with anti-liberal absolutism. And yet for others, he opened the door to John Locke and the liberal theory of government. He taught the priority of rights over duties, and he argued that the sovereign should serve the lowly interest or the lowly ends of providing peace and security, leaving it to individuals to determine for themselves how best to live their lives. Nonetheless, the liberty that subjects enjoy in Hobbes's plan falls in that area that he says the sovereign omits to regulate. Hobbes does not praise vigilance in defense of liberty, and he denounces all efforts to resist the government. At best, one could say Hobbes is a kind of part-time liberal, at best. But Hobbes is best when he is providing us with, in many ways, the moral and psychological language in which we think about government and the state. The state is a product of a psychological struggle between the contending passions of pride and fear. Fear, you remember, is associated with the desire for security, order, rationality, and peace. Pride is connected with the love of glory, honor, recognition, and ambition. All the goods of civilization, Hobbes tells us, stem from our ability to control pride. The very title of the book comes from this wonderful biblical passage from Job, where Leviathan is described as king of the children of pride. And the 19 laws of nature that Hobbes develops in his book really are there simply to enumerate or instruct us about the virtues of sociability and civility, especially directed against the sin of pride or hubris. So the modern state, as we know it and still have it, in many ways grew out of the Hobbesian desire for security and the fear of death